Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue, and I have some questions for you. Award-winning author Rebecca Makkai has crafted an investigation into collective memory and an examination of one woman's reckoning with her past with a transfixing mystery at its heart. A successful film producer and podcaster, Bodie Kane, is content to forget her past, the family tragedy that marred her adolescence, her 4 largely miserable years at a New Hampshire boarding school, and the murder of her former roommate, Thalia Keith, in the spring of their senior year. But when the Granby School invites her back to teach a course, Bodie is drawn to the case and its increasingly apparent flaws. The big question, is the real killer still out there? Rebecca Mackay's last novel, The Great Believers, was a finalist for both the Pulitzer and the National Book Award. Her other books are the novels The Borrower and The 100-Year House. It is a great pleasure to welcome Rebecca Makkai to this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. I enjoyed this book greatly. What brought you to the particular subject?
That boarding school setting is very interesting to me. I think it's often misrepresented. I wanted a more realist view. So I wanted to write about a boarding school. I didn't want to write a YA novel. I wanted to write about an adult looking back. And once I had an adult looking back, then it's going to be a book about memory. It's going to be a book about maybe trying to solve some mysteries of the past. And those could be big or small, but I decided we were just going to go for an actual murder mystery. Having fun with that genre of mystery, but it's also a very realist novel. We're really getting into, this is the kind of case that captures the public imagination, but what does that actually mean? How does the legal system actually work? How do these investigations really work? There's a lot of course, frustrating answers to those questions.
It seems like you had podcasting on the mind, and in the sense of what impact podcasting has had on the true crime world.
Right. I mean, our interest in true crime is nothing new. They literally sold souvenirs outside the Lindbergh baby murder trial.
Right.
There's nothing new. I grew up on Dateline, Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted. Right now, the media for those kinds of stories would be podcasting, internet stuff, Reddit, websites, Twitter. So, I wanted to write a novel that's set now. This is the reality, that the ways that we stare at these cases, that we're still staring, that hasn't changed. The lenses have changed a little. And, true crime podcasting is kind of the lens of the day for looking at those cases. So of course I'm gonna use that a bit.
Tell us about Bodie and what ultimately brings Bodie back to Granby, which is the boarding school, and to say, okay, I didn't have a great time there. And by the way, my roommate got murdered, but I will go back and teach.
Why does anyone go back to any high school reunion ever, right? It's, everyone had pretty much a miserable time, but also maybe a great time at at once. And she's going back in part because there's a friend who, teaches at the school now who asked her. She has a few other reasons for being willing to be back in that area. And of course, there's something, she says, there's something really about walking back into a space where you last felt really small and just kind of, it's not showing any individual person how far you've come, but just measuring yourself against who you used to be. And she's very successful as an adult. And as a student, she was really adrift. She felt very much out of place there. She's a scholarship kid from Indiana. These are all these East Coast kids, not a ton of scholarship kids. And so to be able to walk back in there, it's for herself, right? To see how much she's changed.
Early on, we learned that Thalia Keith is killed in the spring of their senior year. And there is a conviction of the athletic trainer. While it is debated, this is something that as Bodie enters back into the Granby equation, says, I don't want to be a part of, we've done this, I'm done.
Mhm.
But it's really the students that ultimately drag her back in.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there are things tugging at her subconsciously for sure, and that she questions later. She's thinking, "Well, did I, is this really why I came back? There was something bugging me." But at least as far as she thinks at the time, yeah, she comes back. She just wants to have fun, teach this class, reconnect with an old friend. And she's a film historian who also has a podcast. So she's teaching both things. She has a film class and a podcasting class. And the podcast students get to pick their own topics. And one of them wants to investigate the 1995 murder of Thalia Keith, which to this student in 2018 feels like the olden days, this spooky old thing. And because of that podcast, Bodhi, kind of against her will, gets drawn back into these questions.
I was struck by, obviously a lot changes in the time since she left as a student and returns as an instructor, and yet there's still areas that haven't been repainted after the murder. So there's a lot there that even she's surprised at that still exists as a remnant of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, there are just these echoes, right? There are personal echoes. There are also, physical echoes that I don't want to get into spoilers here. But I was really interested in that question of, what is permanent, what is fleeting. And the thing about a boarding school is it is this fundamentally permanent, not permanent, but, and then you have these kids passing through for just 4 years of their lives, but they are 4 years that are huge, that loom large forever within their lives. There's studies just that we have way more memories from adolescence than from any other time. So there are small and huge repercussions still of this thing that happened in 1995. The biggest is that someone is in prison who we come to believe might not be the person who should be in prison, and his life is, ticking away in there. And then these small things too, just people who were there, people who were affected, even people who weren't close to the victim. And the narrator Bodhi is one of those people. She roomed with this girl, but they were not friends. And that's one reason she feels like maybe she shouldn't get involved. Maybe it's not her business. But then maybe everyone feels like that, and maybe that's the problem.
Rebecca Makkai is our guest. The name of the new novel is I Have Some Questions for You. It is published by Viking. Our narrator in this book is Bodhi, and yet we learn fairly quickly when the word you is used that this is being written to someone else.
Right. Yeah, so it's first person, but it's kind of second person a little bit as well. And I don't think this is too much of a spoiler because we learn it early. She's directing this narrative at this guy, Mr. Block, who was her music teacher. She's not writing it. She's not telling it to him. She's just sort of thinking it at him in the same way that, if you went, say, to the neighborhood where your grandparents used to live and they're gone, you kind of feel like that's who's watching you. You'd feel like you're in dialogue with them, right? And she's someone who, when she steps back onto this campus, for reasons she can't quite articulate at first, she feels like she's in conversation with this music teacher to whom she was close, but very quickly starts looking back with a fresh lens and going, he was really close, a little too close to some students. And gosh, there were these rumors about him and Thalia Keith, the girl who died. And what if, and then in the meantime, I assumed those weren't true, but what if we got it right the first time? What if we knew when we were teenagers? What if we were correct? And what would that mean then for this case in which he was not investigated? So the book is directed that way. It's not constant, but that is who she's sort of thinking this all towards.
It's interesting because the book includes the students who are working on the podcast. And of course, Bodhi is a former student and sees herself at that point. And really, it just seems like a lot for any kid to deal with a murder on campus, especially of your roommate, whether you're dealing with it in real time or years later as the result of a podcast of something happened in a building that you're in every day.
Yeah, and because she was someone who felt like she was peripheral to this case, didn't give herself permission to deal with everything. She didn't take advantage of the counselors that the school provided. She didn't grieve because they weren't friends. She didn't tell people everything she knew because she didn't think it could be that important. And yet, of course, it's a lot for her to deal with. She's also someone who's coming into this whole experience as an adolescent from a really traumatic childhood background. And so when this thing happens, it doesn't seem, in her mind, it doesn't measure up. She had her own tragedies. This isn't one of them. And yet at the same time, it was just one more thing on top of all the trauma she's experienced. It, of course, hit her quite hard. And she's, dealing with that for the first time, essentially, in her 40s.
You do this a few times in the novel, and I found it interesting where you'll do a list of things, and it seems like it's everything is different and yet connected. So this is the one where the guy is accused of this. This is the one where the girl is accused of this. This is the one where they found that. This is the one where they didn't find this. And it's a really interesting way of telling the story that, yes, there's differences, and yet it's all awful and sort of the same.
Yeah, there's a sort of refrain throughout of these kind of lists, this deluge of these cases. And it's partly a matter of looking at the public interest in cases like that, but it's also just this sense of, oh my God, they don't end. There are just so many. You feel like you're standing under a waterfall,
Right.
Just again and again, violence against women. But we could do the same thing for, say, police brutality or mass shootings. There are the certain cases that stick out and you remember the details or you really latch onto them personally for some reason. And then there are the ones that just pile up and you can't even keep them straight anymore. And that's partly the effect here. Where that came from, though, that technique in the book is basically I wanted there to be something on the news that was upsetting Bodhi, a news story, and I didn't want to make it a real case, a real thing like the Christine Blasey Ford testimony, something
Right.
like that. I wouldn't have space to give it its due. And I also didn't want to make something up and take all this attention away from the heart of the book. So I basically decided that she's going to talk about it like it's all the cases at once. She's refusing to tell us or Mr. Black, who she's talking to, what case it is that's on the news. She's just like, it was this one. Nope, it was this one. Also, it was this one. And you know what? It was also this one. And so that's a sort of a motif that recurs throughout the book. It's strange to say that I had fun with that because it's a very dark topic, but the writing part, I think I can say it was fun.
It also, I think we should note that there is her estranged husband is also Me Too during all of this. So that adds an issue for Bodhi as she's trying to figure out what's going on. And that doesn't help when her credibility is put into question.
Right. Yeah. This is where things get, my job as an author is to take already complicated issues and then complicate them further.
Right.
My job is not to hand you any easy solutions. At the same time that she's looking back on, on one end of the spectrum, someone who died, right? Major trauma. In the middle of that spectrum, she's looking back on this kid who would harass her in the halls. She's looking back on teachers who were way too close to students. But then, the far other end of the spectrum, her ex-husband is the subject of someone's performance art piece. This woman who's talking about basically being in a pretty bad relationship with him when she was in her 20s and he was in his 30s. Before long, people online are saying that age gap must mean that he was grooming her, even though she was an adult. And at least in the mind of my character, at least in Bodhi's mind, this is taking things way too far. This happened especially in the, after that first wave of Me Too, where it was Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, we got into cases like Aziz Ansari,
Right.
where
A bad
People,
day.
there were people who were like, yeah, no, he's terrible. And a lot of people going, wait, 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 wait. This is not the same thing.
Yeah.
I needed that to be a part of the book too. I didn't want this to all be, hey, we're here for retribution. Everybody better apologize for what they did, because it's mucky. And it does affect the plot. It's not just this thing there as an example. She gets drawn into that too in really unhelpful ways. And it's just part of everything that's going on in her life. And she herself is very upset by the contrast. Why would how can people be demanding blood from my ex-husband just for being bad at relationships when these other people walked away unscathed for all these things that they did that I think are so, to her, she thinks they're so much worse, right?
There is a scene in the book where Bodhi is talking to a woman who also went to school with her at Granby, Beth
Mm-hmm.
Doherty. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason it stuck with me is because Beth is telling her all of these really horrible things that happened to her, the
Yeah.
bullying, different being picked on in school and so forth. And in some of these, Bodhi was a part of them. You write, I said, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I want to be honest here. I'm sorry I took part in that. I talked about it. I don't want to pretend I didn't. It wouldn't have occurred to me in infinite lifetimes that I'd had a hand in bullying Beth Doherty. It's an interesting look at realizing what you have done, realizing how it has affected someone else, and not only how has it affected them, but how it has affected them over a fairly long period of time.
So for context, Bodhi really saw herself as an outsider. She really was. Beth Doherty was, this beautiful, popular, wealthy girl who really, also bullied Bodhi. This revelation that, of course, we all come to sooner or later, that we were not the only one who felt like an outsider in high school, that everybody did, that, you don't know what other people are going through. But this comes at a very crucial moment. This young woman, this woman also has some really relevant information about what might have happened in 1995. But one thing that Bodhi has to realize is that how many systems she was part of unwittingly that caused damage, or just structurally problematic. She was a scholarship kid at this boarding school, but she was part of a school. Nothing wrong with that, right? But she was, and it's the same school that kind of wanted this case solved very quickly. She was a part of this culture of, this rape culture and sexist culture, even though she's also a victim of that. She's a part of the institution of whiteness. Didn't ask to be, but she is. And there's a Black man sitting in prison for this murder. And she, was part of gossiping about this girl at the time, that actually did damage to this girl, and she's awakening to these things at the same time that she's digging into what actually happened. She's digging into what it meant.
You mentioned earlier that our interest in true crime has gone back decades, centuries. I'm struck in this book where what impact podcasting has on the amateur sleuth and the people who are nipping at the heels around the periphery and can get in the way, really, but also can expose some of these that they can help,
Right.
but they can also really release information, reveal information that is
Yeah.
either not accurate or needs some time to be vetted. I thought that was a
Hmm.
really interesting aspect because this seems to be where we are right now in dealing with
Yeah.
this. It's one thing to listen to Serial. It's another to say, okay, I'm going to move to Baltimore and try to figure out the cell phone pings.
Yeah. The book doesn't want to come down on one side or the other of this. There's good stuff and there's bad stuff, right? There are podcasts and websites and, books, whatever it is, that re-traumatize families, that just use these things for entertainment, even though they're over and done and there's not that much more to talk about. and that send people after suspects who might in fact have had nothing to do with this. At the same time, there are podcasts, et cetera, doing Innocence Project work. There are ones where we're able to, get word out there, identify Jane Does, get people to submit familial DNA, and, to cover cases that would not be covered on Dateline. The non-telegenic victim, the person who was not a young, white, wealthy, beautiful girl. Those, because podcasts are plentiful and easy to produce and people can cover whatever they want, we do get more light sometimes shed on cases like that. Of course, the bulk of interest is still in the same things, and that certain cases just get talked about again and again and again. It's tricky. There's good and there's bad, and sometimes coexisting, and that's when I know it's a good subject for a novel. Right?
Right.
Is it's not going to get solved on Twitter or these debates, but a novel can do nuance. A novel can take time. A novel can contain contradictions. We can muck around in this tar pit together for a while.
I think you bring that up beautifully when you talk about Dateline. And there was a Dateline episode that was done about the case early on. Lester Holt is our host. And this is fascinating because it becomes the baseline that most people have, their knowledge baseline of the case. And it stays that way for a really long time. And then you juxtapose that to this podcast world where you have many websites and many podcasters, including Bodhi, looking at what happened.
Right. And it's really a change in the way information is disseminated. That I have this Dateline episode coming out in it's something like 2004. I can't remember exactly what I said, but, internet era, but certainly not the podcasts and the Reddit boards and the social media. And so it gets to be the only narrative. It gets to be the one. Then there's sort of a kind of a web 1.0, like free Omar website that springs up. That's kind of the next phase. And then we get to 2018 and everything's going. Even long before Bodhi gets involved, there's a guy with a whole YouTube channel. There's all kinds of stuff. There are people have drawn maps. People have visited the campus to try to figure this out. It is both, deeply problematic and also perhaps very helpful sometimes, because this is how we actually get at some of the discoveries in the case. And that happens, the same thing can happen in real life. People realize that that little bit of information they had that they didn't think was important might in fact be very important. And if they had just seen the one Dateline and it said, yep, and the guy's in prison, that's where the story would have ended.
Did you not think at the beginning that this would be a mystery, that it would fit into that genre?
No, I wanted a mystery. I wanted to have fun with this. And fun and mystery do not necessarily go hand in hand, but what I mean there is the fun parts of a mystery, the plotting and let me write out the timeline. I wanted to do that. I also didn't want it to be light entertainment. This is a book that, although it is a mystery, is much more likely to be shelved with literary fiction or current fiction than to be shelved on the mystery shelf, because it's not. I think there are people who read certain types of mysteries because of the comforts of genre and the comforts of formula or form. And this is definitely not going to provide those. It is, we do know by the end who did it and why, because I wasn't going to leave people with that kind of dissatisfaction. But this is asking you to think about some pretty uncomfortable things along the way. That was always going to be the book. The murder mystery, if I didn't have my career and I was starting out now, it might be really fun to write, a cozy mystery and just that's who I am. Who knows? But it's not the writing practice I've built for myself. It's not what people expect of me, but that's kind of secondary. It's just not what I do. So yeah, this was always going to be, in some ways, the classic structure of a murder mystery, but it was also always going to be literary. And that's such a fraught word, as if some things aren't literary, but meaning the kind of book that is meant to really make you think, and the kind of book that is meant to find territory we haven't found before.
I think, and I don't mean to overgeneralize in this, and if I do, I apologize, because what you seem to do here in regards to what you were just talking about that seems to be so successful, it's not a book about Me Too. It's not a book about podcasting. It's not a book about
Right.
how we solve crimes. But it does bring all of these things together about boarding schools, about that freedom at such a young age and what happens. There's a lot here to discuss. There's a lot here to think about. There's a lot here to talk about, which is
Mm.
a beautiful stew, really, to come into in a novel and figure things out as you go on.
Yeah, thanks. I start with story, and those things come out of it. And it turns out, when you take something like this, you take a murder, and then you look at it through a realist lens. Oh my God, those themes are there.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have to talk about wrongful incarceration. I have to talk about race. I have to talk about memory. I have to talk about the passage of time. I have to talk about violence against women. I have to talk about, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, when you're in the middle of writing it, it can feel really overwhelming. And it's hard to keep this from being a 7,000 page book. But I do feel like it's a very full novel. I hope it's a very rich novel. I hope it's the kind of thing that gives people a lot to talk about.
We love dogs, so tell us about your dog.
Okay, what you're hearing right now is Matilda. She is a mutt. She is 4 years old, and I think she's greeting someone at the door right now. She's very excited. She's a sweetheart. She's got a lot of personality. She demands variety in her diet to the extent that I think that she's a reincarnated chef.
Well, and obviously loves a little airtime. So there's nothing
Oh yeah.
wrong,
Oh yeah.
nothing wrong with that. The name of the book is I Have Some Questions for You. It is published by Viking. Rebecca Makkai, a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for now.